Thank you, and let's proceed with this webinar on software product management. So it's not blunt product management. We really want to look into what are the specifics with respect to software product management. And the way how we move forward here is that I would first give you some idea about what are current challenges. Then I will illustrate the discipline of software product management with some examples, and also round it up with a brief case study. And obviously, if you have questions to a specific slide that you don't understand, some message which I pass, don't wait to the end. Just put this question to the chat, and then Susan will give that at the next possible break, and I will address it right away. If it's more a general question, we can, of course, also discuss it further on at the end. So let me start with the trends which we currently face. And we have just finished towards year end 21 our annual customer survey, where one of the questions we've been asking since 15 years is always the same, which is, what do you see as short-term and long-term challenges in your own environment? And this is across domains, across industries, and also global. We've been doing this survey over the past years together with IEEE Software Journal, which is a very prestigious journal which reaches out for the software practitioners. And what we found this year, or I should say to the end of 21, but with a perspective on 22, is a quite interesting situation that we see competence as the one dot in the upper right corner. That means it's both a short and a long-term challenge. It's the first time ever that competence would be in this corner. We had been seeing past year innovation, which was clear because after the 1 year COVID lockdown, everybody was eager to now get again back on track. So innovation was the theme in 21. And I think after having passed 21 so successfully for most of us, it's clear that 21 was a year of software innovation, was a year of really accelerating business. But what we all have faced, and this is what we see now, is that we have a lack of competences. And this lack of competence is exactly what illustrate in this graph, where that it's both a short and long-term challenge, because it's not so obvious where would we get all this software and digital experience from. At the same time, innovation has obviously moved towards the left, which means it's still seen as a very important challenge. But first we have to solve the competence topic. And then we have some others, which is what I call a cost complexity trap, because the less you innovate, the more you are in a red ocean. And this is blunt software product management. I mean, red and blue ocean, this is typical terminology to distinguish the competition on cost, that's red ocean, compared to the competition on content, on innovation, on novelty, which is blue ocean. And this triangle, which we can make with these dots, this is what I call the new magic triangle, the magic triangle of the new normal. And what it means is we know the previous magic triangle from project management, which is cost, quality, and content, where you would not really be able to optimize all of them. If you look on time and cost, you would have to sacrifice content. This is exactly what we do with Agile. Earlier, we sacrificed on budget or on time, which is bad because then customers are disappointed. So the magic triangle means that we cannot optimize in isolation. And that's exactly now also the perspective here. We have this issue with lack of competence. So we have to get more agile. We have a complexity cost trap. We have to make our products less complex. And at the same time, we have to free the scarce capacity in order to innovate. This is what we call this 3 dots of this magic triangle of the new normal. And I put that right in the beginning because it illustrates the big leverage which we have to put on product management these days, because it means that we have to get away with some of the, let's say, functionality, with some of the complexity which we were used to in our products, in order to free the resources for innovation. This is product management. And I will show in this webinar more detailed how a product manager can really achieve that. Now, another result from this survey was also that, and this now is probably clear to all of you, the new normal accelerates individual changes. In a way, we typically speak about this new or next normal, but what it really means is that new is normal. That means we are now in a continuous change. And we honestly will not really know what next year will bring. I mean, for sure, we never knew it in terms of the evolution of the pandemic, but I won't really discuss that here because it's not the subject. But also technology is changing fast. And we have to stay resilient. We have to stay flexible enough in order to cope with these ongoing changes. And what we have to be aware is that changes do not just happen. This is a often misunderstood or at least misperceived observation that people would think, well, we can just continue as before and the changes would happen. We have seen in the past 2 years that people can only digest so much change. What we really need is change management. We have to orchestrate transformations. If we, for instance, see as a top result on this survey that people assume that we will have much more online work, online trainings, I should say basically everything remains to a high degree online, then we have to also help the different impacted teams that they can really deal with that, they can digest it, that they not only have the tools. I think we all have the tools in the meantime. We know how to deal with WebEx, with Zoom, with all these tools. It's much more about how do we use this productively? How do we still have this so-called coffee corner chats, which we don't anymore have literally, but we need to synchronize also on topics which are not on our agenda or not on our open issue list. We see number two, more digital transformation. Obviously, we have to improve the workflows. We have to make them more lean in order to get rid of the complexity, as I mentioned earlier. And we see also same work to be done in less time. This is a classic red ocean scheme, which we cannot really get rid of, but we have to free resources not only by pressure, but also by cutting complexity. And the best possible tool for the product manager is obviously that we look into feature content, that we look into the Kano model. I will illustrate what it means in order to focus on what is the value and not to keep legacy, which typically only creates cost. Now, a technology trend which leads us then again also in the dimension of the evolution from a product management perspective is what we call ACES. ACES, for letter abbreviation, Autonomy, Convergence, Ecology Services. You probably have heard it before. It is an evolution scheme along a lot of different technology paths. Autonomy means an increasing amount of automation. You all know about RPA, robust process automation, which we use in IT processes. But we see automation not only on IT processes, we see that in many disciplines. We see it in robots, we see it in medical, we see it in automotive with autonomous cars. So autonomy is one of the mega trends which we have in the years to come. We have convergence, also a complete new pattern, which is that we see product IT and business IT getting together. That is somebody who has only a CS education need to get into product IT. That means embedded real time. If we have this traditional EE exposure with understanding about real-time systems, understanding about distribution, etc., we have to learn about enterprise IT because cloud services inevitably need enterprise IT. That is, we need to grow our competencies from these traditional separated disciplines into what we call the EE-IT convergence. Ecology, that's the catchword since many years, to behave more ecologic. And that is also about topics like green IT, like making sure that what we are approaching is really also helping to reduce our ecologic footprint, because that trend is also mandatory and it's expected, especially from the more younger adults, which now see that we cannot continue as we are used. And IT today already eats something in the range of 10% of our global energy. And that is not only the big powerhouses, it's also the many distributed IT systems which have to get energy and where we have to work upon. And finally, services that I'm sure you all already work upon. It's for sure also about the service-oriented architectures which we are using, but also the services which we put on top of our software in order to make the software more appealing. And again, that means product management. In other words, these 4 trends of the ACEs directly translate into business impacts with an indication of what is the expectation on the market when people go into software. But more than that, also the competence needs which we expect from the people who are working on the software domain. And I put a few examples here, which is this EEIT convergence, which is service-oriented architectures, which is systems engineering. I see in many customer projects that often there's too much local optimization, but not enough system perspective. System perspective means that we are aware not only about the system, but also its context, the usage scheme, the interfaces, the dependencies. Testing is a very important evolution path. Today, most companies spend some 50+% of the total product development cost on verification and validation. We have to automate on the verification along our different Jenkins pipelines with automatic static analysis, with automated unit tests, etc. We have to use test-driven development as the basic schemes, but at the same time, we also have to use this upwards in the stack, for instance, with test-driven requirements engineering, make a requirement a test case. That gives already a basis for regression of the sunny day scenarios. So there's a lot we can do in order to improve our verification and validation, not just to automate, but also to really have a better test strategy than what we have used to. Agile innovation, continuous everything, that is that we have to be much more flexible in the way we develop software, also in terms of really automating not only the build and integration process, the delivery process, but we also have to link that with the necessary, for instance, governance schemes. This is one of the changes in the business landscape, that more than ever product liability is getting critical. There's an expectation with respect to how we use standards, how we achieve quality. And for that reason, I also mention here, first things first, because first things right, because that means that we have really to focus on doing it right at the beginning, not wait until the next verification or validation cycle, because that eats a lot of time. It's an extra cost. Now, when we talk about value, a typical first question which I ask in many of my client projects is about, so how do you perceive the complete functionality of your respective product? And you can do also some assessment. For instance, if you rank features according to the usage, some products have built-in usage measurement, or you ask users, or you ask representatives, proxies of the users, what are the most important features? Which features do you never use? Ask yourself, for instance, for a product like Microsoft Office, which are the functions you really use in Excel, which ones not? You will always see some sort of Pareto distribution. That means there are few functions which you use very much, and there's a lot of functions which you don't really use. And what we see in this pie chart is exactly that pattern. About 50% of the functionality is never used. And this is something which we observe across industries. We have been looking in IT systems, we've been looking in automotive systems, we've been looking in medical. It's the same pattern, that there's a lot of additional complexity which is just accumulated, but it's accidental, as we once learned from Fred Brooks some 50 years ago. He distinguished accidental and essential complexity. Essential is what we need. Accidental is what we just put on top. And as a product manager, our job is value. We are responsible not to sell as much as possible, but to sell value. Because unlike selling with the top line, the product manager also has the responsibility on the bottom line. And I will show in this webinar also the relationship of this top versus bottom line approach. Now, getting now into product management, we need to start with some introduction, even if it sounds a bit odd if I ask what is a product. But honestly, I do that with all my customers, and I get sometimes really strange answers. Too often, they think about the product as something which they deliver and something which is their own creation. But what they don't really keep in mind is that a product actually is measured on the value, on the user experience it delivers. Other than that, it's exchangeable. Even worse, it's not perceived a useful product. That is, if we talk about a product, we have always to talk from a perspective of the customer, of the beholder, of the one which has this product in use, not on our own perspective, which might be limited towards, oh, it's a nice engineering, it's a huge IT, which is really good, because that is something which is our own judgment. But value is the judgment of others. It's a judgment of those who would put money on the table in order to buy this product. Now, it's obvious that a product is not only the software or the hardware, it can be services, it can be a bundle of different and other products. So we could have products in many respects. Most products really have a kind of a stack or hierarchy where the product is built from components, which from a supplier perspective are again products. And in other words, the product itself always have to start with the value which we get across with the product. That's important because if we don't have this notion that we see the product as a bundle of benefits, then it's really difficult to sell it. And this is how we actually earn the money. Now, it's of course clear that we should not only understand the product, but we should understand what makes the product a winning product. And a winning product, I show here one of the early examples of something which we all know, which is a smartphone. That is a product which makes your customer really say, wow, this is something which I need, even if they have never seen it before. Steve Jobs was excellent in doing that, because when he showed up in a show, in a presentation, he would always have at the end this famous statement, which is, there's something more I want to say, and he gets something new out of his whatever box or what I had with him, and presented a product which made you say, wow, Apple did it once again. And the reasoning behind is we have to think in terms of value in many dimensions. For sure, value is much more than technology. Value is much more than features. And Apple was the first, Steve Jobs was the first to acknowledge that it's not about the features. He said the product is good when there's nothing left to cut. And what he really meant was sometimes to really have to cut even performance factors. iPhone 1, 2, 3 were extremely poor on telephony. And that made competitors really smile and say, okay, Apple tries a telephone, but they will never succeed. Well, that was not exactly true, because what Apple tried was a new business model. What Apple tried was a new user experience, and they were excellent on that. The telephony you had anyway. So I observed many people those days, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, who would have on their desk two telephones. I mean, they didn't show two. They had one telephone in their pocket, that was the old Nokia. And they had one on the desk, which was the Apple. And the Apple was there to show, I have the money to buy me an Apple phone. For a telephony, they used the Nokia. But in order to have all these fancy gadgets, they used the Apple. And this is exactly what they wanted to achieve. That was perceived the winning product. And they were the winners in this race on the best smartphone. So it's much more than the technology, it's much more than the features. It's about an exciting marketing, it's about an ecosystem, it's about an innovative business model. At those days was the whole app store, etc. And this is what makes the winning product, not just the technology. And this is something we have to learn, because too often, especially in B2B, we just focus extremely on the RFQ content, feature by feature. And that is an overkill, knowing that half of these features are actually not even worth being brought into a feature list. It really eats a lot of effort. It eats effort in the product design and the maintenance in the whole life cycle. Much better to focus, how can I get a value to the customer? And I've seen many situations where if you have one or two exciting new functionality, you can also negotiate about this huge feature catalog which is presented in the RFQ. Now, one way to create a winning product is that you reconsider your positioning. And here's one simple approach which would help doing that, which is you can look in your existing product, or if you want to enter a new market, you look in the current market leader, and you ask yourself, so in which way do they really excel? And then you put some dimensions, like we have done in this radar diagram, which is about, can be performance, can be functionality, pricing, the license model you're using, the services which you provide, or IT-specific topics like installation, administration, usability, maybe some automation. All these facets would be, first of all, buying criteria, but not all have the same relevance. And not on all we would really be leading. You see that with these two different patterns here. The one which is a competing or a start product would be excellent on functionality, maybe far too much features, would be fair on performance, not so good on the pricing, and also license, not so interesting. But surely it has a lot of functionality. This situation often is perceived by new entrants and competitors that they would always run to catch up on functionality. And that would be a race they cannot win because the functionality gap is too big. So what you need to do, vice versa, is you have to look in this other dimension. You have maybe to even create a new dimension. For instance, here you would say, well, this other product is really poor on usability. How can I make this nice user experience? This is what Steve Jobs was doing with the iPhone, or before that with the iPod, because he was just thinking, how can I, in a saturated market, I mean, the iPod was saturated MP3 players, the iPhone was saturated telephony market. Still, he entered, but he never entered to make a catch up with the market leads on functionality. He looked into those facets which currently were not adequately supported by these competitors. And that's exactly what happens in most markets these days. If there's a new entrant who really want to grow, they would look into other features than this one or two lead features, which are anyway already in a position which is difficult to attack. And then they would define maybe a roadmap, maybe just a way to move forward in order to deliver according to this defined USP, unit sales position, versus the incumbent. And that's exactly what we see with the picture. Of course, not exactly with this dimension. They depend on your market. They depend on your own product. But that you ask yourself, how would I enter this market with this incumbent if I want not to be in a red ocean on functionality and cost, but I want to much more get user attendance, for instance, by a convincing service. That's something which I see these days still as a very critical topic, because often software is not perfect. So you sell it together with consulting, you sell it together with additional installation or with additional services which help your users and your customers to make it a benefit. And therefore, I recommend always the product managers which I'm working with, that they ask themselves not only what's the capability of my own product, but first and above all, what would be the customers of my customers? What would optimize, what would increase their perceived value? Because if you happen to have a product which helps your customers to satisfy their own customers, to grow their own business, then you're on a good way to have a winning product, especially in B2B. The less you really consider this relationship in terms of help your customer grow their own business, the much more difficult it would be really be to have a sustainable, good, or even winning product. Vice versa, also ask yourself, if you have today a good product, what would a new entrant do? And that's exactly this other important question you ask yourself as a product manager, which is, as a new entrant, knowing about what I just said, you won't try to see functionality as a hurdle. This is old-time thinking. The new entrant would take, exactly as I said, he would forget about the functionality. He would think in terms of what's functionality I really need to have in order to get my foot into the door. But then they would start to think in terms of what are the weaknesses of the current incumbent. So if you ask yourself as somebody who has a really good product, what would a new entrant do? Don't be confident because you have a good functionality or good customer base. These things can disappear rather fast. Ask yourself, what would your competitor be doing? How would I start on the greenfield without a legacy? And a legacy is a major topic because you have seen in this magic triangle of the new normal, this cost complexity trap. Many of us which have good products are caught in this complexity trap. We have to maintain a lot of functionality of the past. And here's again a good example. Not only we talk about Apple vis-a-vis all the Nokia, Ericsson, etc., which we had last century. I mean, they were all in this complexity trap. But look to the automotive market today, for instance, and there are other markets where we see similar patterns. I mean, here is all these big successful OEMs, which all have one thing in common, which is far too much complexity. They have a lot of variation, they have a lot of functionality. However, they are vulnerable when it comes to speed. And this is exactly where Tesla started and many other new entrants would start, not to copy the extreme huge amount of complexity and variation, but rather to think in terms of what is missing. What are technologies which are currently missing, which somebody incumbent would have difficulties to grow on product. And that is some of the success recipes I want to get across when we think about value, that we really keep in mind the value is not what we currently deliver as functionality. The value is what is perceived. And that brings me to the third question, which you should ask to your, let's say, audience, which is speak with your non-customers. Non-customer means the people who are currently not buying your product, who would buy a competing product or not at all one of these products. Try to find out what prevents them from not using your product, not buying your product. So here's 3 questions. The one would be, what would a new entrant be doing in order to enter the field? And what would you do as a new entrant? Is this the starting point, depending whether you have already a product in the door in the market or you want to get one into the market? And the third question, definitely, what are those who are not my customers reasoning? Why are they not my customers today? And how can I create value for their customers? Because that's the only convincing argument. And that allows us then to finally coin a brief definition of what is a product manager, what is product management. Product management is the management of a product. That's a no-brainer. Over the life cycle with the objective of generating the biggest possible value to the business. Again, we have this magic word of value here. It's about value maximization. It's not about top line maximization, value. And the product manager would be the business manager of a product. We call it a mini CEO typically. That is a champion who drives the product success and who would also reach it. So that means the product manager is definitely connecting different disciplines. He has to understand the sales in order to understand what's the need in the market. He has to understand marketing. How do I create needs? He has to understand also the engineering and not the least also the operations in terms of how do I get this product into the markets? How do I support? How do I service the product? All that belongs also to the responsibility of the product manager. Now, most product manager who I discuss this scheme would initially say, well, that's just too much. And I tell them, look, there's one thing you have to understand, because in software, most product managers come either from marketing or they come from technical. You have to get away from the current way of working. Otherwise, it's really too much. But if you only think in terms of engineering and development, you have to step backwards from the technology side. If you think very much in terms of marketing, you have to step backwards and get more into technical topics. Because only if you master these different pillars from sales to marketing to technical to operations, then you're able to really optimize the value of the product. And this is where we position the product management. In order to grow the success of the product, he would have projects. This is, for instance, an engineering project, a marketing project. And also one of the challenges, he would typically not have a big army of people. That makes him also specifically, let's say, specific in the company, because typically he would have people working with him who are allocated because the senior management sees the value in this product. And therefore, the positioning in the middle management, but without a big line organization, means a product manager leads by a strong vision. He leads by convincing reasoning why this product is really good. And he leads by having those things which others would like to work for. And that gives naturally in a company always a competing situation, because you would have different product managers and you have to fight to get the best possible competences in your company. And that means naturally you would focus to really have this winning product, because the engineers, marketeers, they immediately know what's the interesting product. They don't want to work for a legacy, which is not really much value. They want to work on something which is fancy, which is really convincing. And that is exactly the way how the product manager would attract the right resources. So in the enterprise, in the middle management position, we see on the top level, we have the enterprise, we have the business units, a typical breakdown. Then we have product lines or departments. That would be where the product manager is positioned. And then we have the individual projects, which are managed by project managers. Now, if we compare project and product, one thing which is immediately clear is the project typically has a defined begin and end. That is, we have different type of project, development, maintenance, marketing. These are all projects. And we have one product which starts out with strategy, which evolves towards the concept, that's requirements, planning, etc. Then we have the development and the market entry, which run pretty much in parallel. And we have the evolution, which kind of makes a cycle, because evolution, of course, goes back into the strategy. That's also why we call it a life cycle, because it's actually a cycle. I put it here horizontal in a linear sequence, because still we see also dependencies. We don't want to build a development without having the requirements, and we don't want to select requirements without having a clear strategy and vision. So there is some sort of dependency, but not in a way that this is completely linear. There could be iterations. And for sure, we see today much more agile product management than we saw before. And this is also how we distinguish the project from the product. The product has to cover all these 5 activities or phases over time, and also in the renewal, because evolution is the one big value generation in software. Now let me go through these 5 topics one by one, and we start out with strategy. Strategy is about understanding needs, maybe also creating needs. It's the business case of your customer. We need to understand the environment in which this product would be used. And that means also we have to develop solution according to these needs. That is, we start typically with commercial analysis. What's the competition? What's the possible pricing? What segments to address? We don't want to be the check of all sides. We need to be focused on a product where we really know the market. We know how to talk to this market, the benefits and the value of this market. We need to get engaged also in technical analysis. That is why I said it's a mix of marketing and technical. And we have to be able to identify critical success factors. That's a game which I often do with the product manager, that we really play with scenario, even complete different products, and try to find out what are success factors which competences do we need? Which materials or which suppliers would we need? What are the IPR? We see today a lot of evolution in terms of software-related IPR. What used to be the user interfaces, the middleware, is evolving towards flexible services. That means our own IPR is also going to change. The result of the strategy is a strategic assessment, as typically called a SWOT, strength, weakness, threats, and opportunity. That is, we look to the short term and long term in terms of the chances and the risk. Strength, weakness, that's today's situation. Opportunity, threat is tomorrow's situation. A strength, an opportunity is positive, it's a chance. A weakness or threat, that would be the negative. It is a risk. And this is what we evaluate in the SWOT. And we, of course, not only do a SWOT for ourselves, but also for the competitors. The result of this strategy would be a business plan, a product vision, marketing plan, etc. And let me start and add a very hands-on recommendation here, which is begin with the end in mind. You for sure have heard this topic before. It's one of the 7 habits of the highly successful people of Stephen Covey. And I like it very much because it's really getting the whole setup of strategy into a very brief sentence, which is think in terms of what do you want to achieve? What would I do if my product is on the market? What's next? What if people are asking for more? How do I filter? So that is continuously ask what's next and how does it fit towards what I need to do today to achieve this next possible steps. Which are the A customers I want to serve? Which markets I don't want to address? That's also important. Cannot be complete. We have to focus in content. We have to focus in markets. How do I avoid red ocean? How do I open into more blue ocean schemes, into more innovation schemes? What would be the value which I pass on to my customers? Also very, let's call it simplicity. What's my portfolio? What do I deliver? Is my portfolio manageable? Can I service it? So this is all what we try to achieve in a strategic analysis. And we typically coin that into what is called a business canvas. The business canvas is a helpful tool. It's a one-pager which brings together different dimensions in terms of here on the left side, what's our product, what is its value, what market it address, which customers, which channel we use, also the cost structure and the risk mitigation. You see immediately there's nothing about technology, there's nothing about requirements. That comes afterwards. It's first of all just a positioning and a way how we can also follow up whether our assumptions are correct. That's one of the key deficiencies which I see in many companies, that though they do product management, they take assumptions, never check them. So they repeat errors again and again. If you make a business case which is not successful, the great news is you can learn from that. You can learn why were certain assumptions not fulfilling, and you can improve on them. This is something which to make much as a routine for our way of working. Now, this is what I mentioned, this strength, weakness, opportunity, threat. We do that not only for ourselves, which is in the middle, but we do that also for our competitors. And we relate that to each other. Because we can, again, learn a lot if we know our competitors' strength and weakness. Because one thing is for sure, our competitor is doing the same. And so it's a kind of a challenge, which we can only win if we really build upon the weakness, the threats of our competitors. As a newcomer, that's exactly what we have seen in this radar diagram. You succeed if you understand those strengths of your customer, which is not your turf to compete, but then also look into what is their weakness, where do they have the gaps, and then you deliver in these gaps as understanding that the market has a need or you can create that need. And you do that for your, let's say, shortlisted competitors, and then you can adjust your own SWOT. And then you can make planning, blue ocean plan. Can I set up new rules, new pricing schemes, new payment schemes, new services? Or red ocean, do I really get into an attack? What would be the way to defend? So we try to get into this blue ocean scheme, but we have to prepare for whatever we are doing. There can be situations where we suddenly end up in the red ocean, and we have to prepare for both. So here's a short example, which is kind of eye-opening in terms of how do we really deal with the SWOT. Strength, and this is now a real example. It's a market leader, defines the standards, known technology, etc. Weakness, a lot of legacy and complexity, technical debt. So that shows already a picture which many companies these days have. Good products, but uncertain future. Heavy process, a lot of, let's say, things which have organically grown, but which would not be sustainable. Not attractive to software experts. So the real good young people would not go to this kind of old-fashioned technology. Now the opportunities, you can reinvent your business model, innovate on service, but also threats. Competitors can also be very fast. You might not be competitive because of the high cost. You don't have the right competences on board. Wrong mindset. Now, for each one, we can distill also strategic answers. For the strengths that we focus on the value, we always have to build upon our strength. For the weakness, we look rather to our non-customers and nightmare competitors in order to identify which of my today weaknesses are really worth being leveraged. For the opportunities, that's what I would use in order to cure my weakness of today. And the threats, that is the weakness of tomorrow, that I use my opportunities, my strengths, in order to build up. And a good example in history was Netscape versus Microsoft in the browser war. Now, this is already a while ago, but still one of the most illustrative stories in terms of product management. There was Netscape, which was with a far distance leading the browser market. They had 90 plus market share. So 9 out of 10 persons using the browser were on Netscape. I myself used Netscape for a while when studying, and it was a good product and fancy. There was Microsoft, which tried hard to get their Internet Explorer into the market, but it was always considered as something clumsy, something typical Microsoft, so you would not really use it. Now, the problem with Netscape was they were growing too fast. The problem was that they tried to get features out of the door in a situation where this HTML standards was also very fast growing, and increasingly they accumulate technical debt. Microsoft, on the other side, was at the risk of a similar situation because the standards apply to them as well. But at a given moment, Bill Gates said, let's make a stop and do two things. Let's redesign our browser and let's see how we can integrate with other components, with Windows, etc. And they paused and they restarted. And that was, in a way, the end of Netscape, because this new Internet Explorer had much more functionality than this old Netscape. And it was also easier to maintain, it was easier to grow. So in other words, it was future safe, while Netscape was legacy, even in a market which only was a few years old. But that can happen quite fast. And there were many engineers, managers in Netscape which realized that they cannot continue like that. But the perceived market pressure was so immense that they just didn't want to step backwards. And the rest is what we call history. So within a very short time frame, Netscape went from their 90% market shares completely to zero. I mean, Netscape is not existing anymore. We have Firefox, which initially maintained some of the legacy, but soon realized that this was really an insufficient code base. But we see on the other side, we have Microsoft with the Edge. We have Opera, of course, today. We have different type of browsers, but it shows, similar to what we saw also with the smartphone market and Apple, that you can start out of a position where you have no market share, just avoid that you copy paste what your competition is doing. Now, concept, that would be the activity after you have a strategy, which is then defining what are the requirements. What would be your precise competitive advantage? What would be what you call the elevator pitch in order to get your product across? At the same time, we have also to see that with all our requirements, we continuously reduce our costs and technical debt. We should strive for what we call good enough quality. The result is a good and solid product definition with underlying business case, requirements with excitement, and a realistic planning. That's something which often overlooked, that we need a planning which is realistic, that our engineers, our developers really buy in. This is all what the concept is about. One element in the concept is this agile prioritization. I mentioned already that we have to get rid of this basically 50% of functionality which is not worth anything. Unfortunately, nobody would really label our requirements as something this is value and this is no value. We have to do it ourselves. And there are techniques around which we are using, such as requirements poker and similar technique, which I often do with the product manager. We use real money, by the way, because only that makes it really serious. And we use as an underlying method this Kano model. Now, the Kano model is very simple to see the method behind. It distinguishes the content into three factors: base factors, performance factors, excitement factors. A base factor would be things which nobody really talks about. They are expected. However, especially in IT, many are not necessary. And you have to identify those which are not necessary. That was what Apple is excellent in, others as well, Tesla. Then performance. This is typically the content of an RFQ. That's the expectation of the market. You need it other than the base factors, but you have to also consider that the performance factors of today would be the base factors of tomorrow. So consider complexity. What is really interesting are the excitement factor. Excitement factor is the only way how you convince a non-customer that your product would be interesting if you have much less functionality. And I guess we all know excitement factors from our own life in terms of when we go to a shop and we realize that here and there are functionality which we would have put on our list, but which is not in the product, but suddenly we see this one product which is really outstanding because of a single feature, maybe a nice service behind, which we think, yes, that's the thing I have not thought about. And this excitement is what we have to strive for as a product manager. How do we create excitement or delight which help us to convince a market which other than that would really compete only on a long list of features where we would not succeed. And that's also from a requirements perspective, something which I continuously get across, which is select the requirements, not collect them. I see people walking through the feature list, or they go to have workshops where they collect inputs from different stakeholders. Sometimes I see requirements where I would really ask them in workshops to my clients, are you sure this is really helpful? And I say, Mr. X wanted to have that, or this market needs it. I say, but what would they do with it? And we discuss it and suddenly realize, well, it's indeed not making so much a difference. And this is how basic factors enter a product even earlier than they become performance factors. They would just be collected maybe from people who would never ever really have to pay for this product. This is the most dangerous breed, by the way, because if you talk with stakeholders in a workshop, which later on don't have to pay for the product, you get a lot of interesting ideas, but these people don't pay for it afterwards. So they only generate complexity. So try to find out who would pay and what is their business. These are the people to talk to when you really develop requirements. Now we have often the situation of this quadrant here with the known knowns. This is where most of our RFQ happen. This is most of where we really talk with customers. We as a supplier know the discipline, the customer knows his needs. This is where the requirements are. Sometimes the customer has a couple of needs which we don't know. Then we have to ask in a workshop the open questions. This is exactly where workshop makes sense. The more interesting part is, however, what our customer is currently not aware of, because that could be his future business. So we can, for instance, in areas where we are experts, have our customer benefit from our market knowledge. And here in the upper right, this is the most interesting quadrant, the unknown unknowns. This is where you can really create excitement. If you understand potential needs of your customers, which are not yet in your own portfolio, but you try to understand how can I really deliver that. Again, Apple, it was this Gorilla Glass, this big screen, which was from the first iPhone, always the very obvious showcase of the Apple telephone. And Steve Jobs had long discussions with Corning, who was developing this glass, in order to find out what's possible. And finally, they found a solution to make a glass as big as the screen, or almost as big as the screen. And this was, what is a delight? This was trying to create a need, because it's a very nice piece of art as well. And at the same time, it has a high user experience, because this old-fashioned Nokia phones, which you open close, that was not anymore really so fancy, but just have a phone which is flat, simple, appealing. That was the idea which he had, and that was one of these unknown unknowns, because it came first. And of course, this has to continuously evolve, but here we are. On this lower right, which is the topics where we can still benefit because we all learn, is we use negative scenarios. For instance, misuse case, abuse case, and we try to find out how can we avoid those. That again creates interesting functionality. And that brings us into what I called earlier the magic triangle of the new normal, that we optimize the magic triangle. It's also part of the concept. We prioritize content in order to keep time and cost, to keep our commitments, specifically in B2B. This is what is the expectation in the market, that we deliver according to commitments. And that means we always have to start out with an MVP, a minimum viable product. What is the core in terms of content, the cost, and the time? And then we can add functionality, another set of features, priority 2, etc. And we can flexibly adjust depending on what's possible. Now, after strategy and concept, we have to do things. That's development and that's market entry. Development, the classic IT, the classic engineering, R&D. This is not the job of the product manager, he controls it. So the product manager have to get visibility. Again, with agile approach, you get good visibility, because in the best possible case, your agile feature content is steadily increasing. And at the same time, when it is integrated and tested, you know also that the value of your product is ramping up. That's, by the way, what we call earned value in classic project management. The idea was very simple, that value is not achieved in a step function, it's achieved as a continuous growth. And agile really plays in advance of earned value, because we slice increments to small steps, which we continuously integrate and test, and therefore have a continuously increasing value of the product. In other words, we can really check progress based on this earned value. Now, value and cost is, of course, this odd couple which we have in development. We have to improve the value, performance and excitement factors. Also invisible things, quality, technology, architecture, portability, usability. And we have to focus on how can we control cost, decrease cost, cut out unnecessary base factors, avoid too many changes, avoid over-engineering. And on invisible, reduce organizational complexity, focus on value stream, manage your technical debt, because it will kill you eventually. I have currently a customer where the people are very clear we have too much technical debt. It's the same as with Netscape in the previous example, but they don't have the guts and maybe also not the opportunity to restart. Microsoft could restart because they had a huge amount of assets. That's not always the case. So let's better avoid or at least continuously minimize technical debt, because sooner or later it will kill us. Market entry, this is the classic marketing project where we have to position our product. We think in terms of pricing, promotion, performance, the 4P as we call it. The +1, this is an invention which I had once for a project and in the meantime use very often. It's not only about product placement, price, promotion, but also performance. How would I measure the performance? How would I measure with KPI? And in the meantime, especially in B2B, we use a lot of KPIs, feature usage, user experience, all sort of feedback in order to make sure that we have a real good understanding of what is the performance of our product. The goal is a successful market launch, good coordinated communication, so that if different people would go to different customers, different fairs, they communicate the same roadmap. And preparation for the evolution. They will not say, okay, this is our release 1 and then afterwards we will see. No, we have to prepare next release. We have to prepare distribution channels, partners, services. That's in software very important. And in order to deliver value, we also have to understand that the value would be really something which has this two-dimension, to develop the market that is more sales and marketing related, and to deliver, to ensure feasibility. That's more the engineering and product management side. A key element is also pricing. That's something where we currently focus a lot, software pricing, because it's entirely different from the classic schemes, which is cost plus. That is sometimes possible, but mostly for companies which work on legacy business models. Much more interesting would be a value and usage-based pricing, but it's also difficult to achieve, or at least balance the pricing with respect to what is the market willing to pay. And you can make price models with the software. We can also introduce pricing models, for instance, by having a product catalog available. We have functionality maybe in 3-dimension, basic, medium, and high, where we can then also adjust what are we going to deliver, how much are we going to deliver. There have been many studies and an article, I think, January last year on Harvard Business Review, which was looking into which are the typical selection schemes. And they found the best approach with pricing is you have these 3 categories I just mentioned, base, medium, and high. You can call it whatever. Rarely customers would buy the lowest category. They would always go to the medium, and depending on their own perception of themselves, they go to the premium category. And that is, if you offer only features in the list, then they start to negotiate and you're in a red ocean. If you offer feature groups according to that scheme with the base, medium, and high, they would typically think in terms of, I need to have this medium. And when they start negotiations, you could argue and offer packages which take some of the features from the lower group. Maybe you want also to add a feature of the premium group so that they see an excitement factor. But this is the art of software pricing, that you try to get your customers into this middle segment and not in this red ocean lower price segments. And then you can, of course, also argue with nice service schemes. Maybe you achieve some possibility to really get into customer loyalty. That is, for instance, with software, the learning curve. It's very costly typically to introduce the software, not because of licenses, but because of the learning amount to use it, to integrate it, to learn all the technologies behind. So try to get your software away as cheap as possible so that you get a broad user basis. and benefit afterwards from feature deliveries, from annual service contracts, etc., so that you have some payment schemes which are not based on the initial set of features, but more on the continuation. And finally, we have evolution. Evolution is how do we maintain and increase the value of the product. That's for software pivotal, because we cannot simply say, well, this is now frozen content, which we will sell for years to come. We have to continuously assess and update our feature content. And we do that typically the same way as we discussed in the strategy. This is why it also fuels, again, in the life cycle, the strategy and concept, which is we learn from the market, we learn from the non-customers, we learn from how would a new entrant behave, and we try then to get this across in the delivery. Now back to the basics, make a plan for the market entry and for the service. I have seen many software products failing because there was not enough service capacity. In other words, what turned out a big initial wave of contracts later on was really killing that company because they were unable to cope with the many service requests. In other words, you have to grow your product and customer base in parallel to the services. That's something which is often overseen. Now, with all that, we can look into comparing the roles and responsibilities vis-a-vis each other: product management, product marketing, project management. We learn every project, define begin end, product management, the whole product marketing. How do I create a need on that market? How do I communicate along my 4+1P? How do I deliver my marketing plan? While the product manager much more as a results champion, how do I optimize my top line and bottom line? That is what we call the return on investment. What is the roadmap of the different dependencies? We work with many customers on road mapping, and that is far more than technology. It's about starting out with the features, with the segments, which markets you want to attract, with what features then we come into technology. What technology do you need tomorrow, have to prepare today? What competences do you need tomorrow, have to prepare today? This is what we call the road mapping. For yourself, one recommendation is what we call self-management. That is, focus on the urgent things, focus on the important things. That's what we call the Eisenhower matrix. First things first, strategy, concept, planning, customers, market. That is your focus as a product manager. Others you delegate, or you don't even touch, or you might delay it. That's what I'm also doing. I mean, I get every day numerous things to do, much more 150 miles per day, and you have to briefly scan and decide, okay, what is really the ones which I want to put here, and the others would fall down. And it's not for the perfectionist, it's not for the actionist. That is a critical performance profile in terms of the personality of a good product manager, that the good software product manager is the one who can deal with this good enough principle, who can get a value in talking to the customers and to the non-customers, who is able to judge on the technology perspectives and challenges, but also on new endeavors to take. And this is the scoping, not the perfectionist, not the actionist. Now, a short case study, which with a client we had a while ago. It was about a complex legacy situation, high volatility of requirements beyond the 20%, where productivity decreases, and the business need was more service-oriented business. And so a first step was that we make an assessment. We found a lot of technical debt. For instance, we looked into what could be done. That was to evaluate also trade-off of different actions. And we started out that we first of all reduce the complexity and the technical debt in order to free capacity for the next innovation steps. Now, in our say solution portfolio, which we introduced, we already looked forward into what's next, and that means early defect detection was clearly on technical debt, reduce the complexity, reduce the accident. Incremental development become more reliable. Also, a continuous integration that would help in ensuring that you deliver quality. Teamwork, that was already a principle which was much more difficult to introduce because we had really to change the organization to make teams around product components or around functions, but with a value perspective. And the biggest change was the one in the organization and culture thing in terms of solution, service, not this traditional project business, much more what could be the deliverables which I really want to get across in a more midterm situation. And we, of course, use also some KPI to measure. Each dot would be a product, a delivered project to a customer. And we saw initially a lot of delay, which was increasingly reduced. You see that on the right side, moving into the target zone of, let's say, a variance of 10%. Better is typically extremely costly. So if we deliver with a commitment on a range of 10%, that is typically what we consider useful, beneficial. Now, to summarize, my recommendation from a software product management perspective, future-proof your business. Think in terms of needs. Consider always this radar diagram. What is your position today, your competitor's position? Focus on where you create needs in areas where you could show strength. Use an existing platform that allows reuse and focus on the elements to create the value. Agile team, empowerment, prove the value, follow up the value, ask to the customers, would it help? Talk with the non-customers and grow incrementally. Innovation is about increment. Innovation is not about this one big bang. The excellent companies today grow in small steps, but they grow continuously. And avoid the traps, which I also mentioned throughout this webinar. Now, one quote of a client about the relevance of product management, because I mean, when we talk about product management, as I said, you need also the eyes of the beholder. So this lady was at the time when they were with the clients responsible for a group of product managers, said it's pivotal, glues together the different functions, gives us a 360 perspective. With all this responsibility, product managers' skills need to be diverse. So it's not a standard skill set. We have to evolve the skills. And they really spend considerable energy to grow the product management role. And they also say we measure and we see the return on investment of the product management, because the KPIs would include not just top line, bottom line, but also market growth, getting non-customers on board, etc. And therefore, you have a cost with educating, with a product management process, but you also have the benefits. And one thing which we also learned in the past year, and this is a cartoon which I was drawing end of last year for a conference, who tries innovation? It's not the CEO. I mean, he has maybe a lot of business experience, but certainly the challenges are somewhere else. The customers to limited perspective, because they give you new ideas, they give you a value perspective. But what I really saw was it was also this game-changing wake-up call that we have to change the way of working. And that was possible because, as I mentioned, in the 2020 with the lockdown, people became anxious. Where are we going to end up if this continues? 21 was the year of innovation, but we innovate so fast that today we lack the competences. And now we are in this new situation with the magic triangle of the new normal, where we have the lack of competence, where we have this need for innovation. Of course, that's the good news. There's a real demand in the markets. And we have this cost complexity trap on which we have to work in order to reduce the complexity and therefore make us future safe. And that brings me to the end. And I appreciate that you listen to this podcast. You can reach me at consulting-info@vector.com or just on our internet site, vector.com/consulting.
Thank you so much, Christof, for joining us today.
Thank you.